Hello, welcome to the first part of the toy train carriage tutorial series. I don't know if that'll be the title, but we'll come to that later on. I originally did this as one long video and it was very long, so I've decided to split it into smaller bite-sized chunks so I can cover all the topics at a reasonable pace without rushing through everything. In this first episode I'm going to be talking about the track itself because there are certain features you need to be aware of in regards to actually building this. So without further ado, we'll get started. I'm going to hide this train carriage because we don't need it for this episode. So this track is relying on a spline. Show you these two splines. We've got the main spline, which is what's driving most of the geometry for the track, and will also be the thing which will animate the train carriage in the next episode. Then we have a rail which is used for orienting the track. So if I go back into here, starting with the cloner, we've just got these plank things being swept along the main spline, and then we've got this rail spline to keep it oriented. And I'll show you what the rail's doing in case you're unaware of what that actually does. If I were to come up here, you see the track is nice and level. If I were to go in the cloner and remove that rail, it goes all skew with it just bends at the wrong angles and stuff like that. So we don't want that. Not on this railway track anyway. It's not intended. So I've done this to keep it nice and level. The next part of the track is, if I unsolo again, to do these two railway rails. I need to stop saying rails, it's going to get confusing. And these are basically just two extrudes with a lot of subdivisions along them just so they can deform nicely along the track. And I'm using a spline wrap to wrap it along the main spline. However, not sure if you noticed, I'm actually using a couple of instances of the spline. So we've got the main spline as an instance and the rail as an instance, which I've put in here. The reason being is that I wanted to offset them from the planks, and this is the way which kind of worked for me. The good part of this is that, say, once I've offset it and everything, I can go to the main spline and adjust the points and it'll still affect the instances, so it keeps everything nice and procedural without having to be too constrained with how to model it. The other reason for using spline wrap is that I have access to the rail and I can basically have it deform in a similar manner to the cloner, because if I were to use sweeps, like if I were to try and offset this spline here, say for example, I'll just use a rail just so we can see it. So if I selected all these points and went to create outline, I could, oh, I did create a new object then, which is good. It's what I wanted. It's just that it went all funky there for a moment. You see we've got this outline here. It's not actually level with where it was before, and you basically end up with something similar to what we had before when we turned off the rail. It's just, it doesn't go as intended. So that's why I've ended up opting for a spline wrap, because it's deforming both of these rails in the same manner and in a similar way to how the clone is being deformed. So that's one of the main important points for the track. The other one is to do with the interpolation points on the spline. So if I were to hide this, we've got the main spline. I'm going to hide the rail now because you don't need this anymore. We've got this main spline and we look at the points. You can see we've got one point here and then the second one's there, and a few more here, and then we've got these dense clusters of points. And this isn't an issue at the moment because we're using intermediate points to generate uniform points along the spline. I'll explain what's going on there and like why that's important. Let's go to this little demo. which I've set up. We've got 2 flower splines. One which is straight out of the box. You've got the standard adaptive intermediate points with 5-degree angle, and then we've got another one which is using uniform intermediate points, and I've set the number to 16. Now if you were to make these editable, you won't see any difference really. Points are the same, and if you look at them, we've still got uniform intermediate points and adaptive there. However, if we just go back, if we were to do current state to object, that's when you start to see what's really going on under the hood. Now if I were to select this, they both have linear interpolation because the intermediate points they had before have now been baked into the object, so you can see what's actually going on. With the adaptive, you have dense clusters of points where deformation is needed, and barely any points where deformation isn't needed. So it's being as efficient as possible and optimizing where appropriate, which is what you'd want for the most part. However, in this uniform flower, we've got points evenly distributed, which is what we need, and I'll show you why. Using these 2 cubes to represent the train carriage, I'm going to give these align to spline tags, and I'm going to set the first point to 0%, and then the next one, I'm going to set this to 100%. And I'm going to be focusing on the easing here, so I want to make sure there's nothing else interrupting what's going on. So I'm going to have a linear motion, so there shouldn't be any easing. And then I'm going to copy that track and paste it in the other null. I'm just going to drag this in the F curves so we can compare the two, and you can see they're literally the same, identical. However, when we go to move through the animation, we've not even assigned the splines. Silly. So the uniform one, we want to make sure it's got the uniform spline. The adaptive one, make sure it's got the adaptive one. Okay, now when we scrub through, you can see they're both moving differently, like there's some sort of easing going on. And most notably, the bottom one is jumping all over the place. It's going nice and slow on the curves and then jumping on the straight points on the, or straight lines on the spline. Now that's what the intermediate points are all about, and why they're important, because the way this percentage parameter works for the position, it's not relating to the length of the spline or the distance on the spline. It's strange because 0% would correspond to the front of the spline and 100% would correspond to the end of the spline. However, you need to reframe it to 0% being the first point on the spline and 100% being the last point on the spline. Now the key difference between those two definitions is that, as you can see here, it's jumping to the points on the spline. It doesn't really care about the actual spline itself. That's just a visual indicator as to where it's going to be going next, pretty much, like the direction of this object, where it's going to be going. It's somewhat like the path of the object. However, it's not actually going to be moving along that path. It's going to be jumping between the points, which is why it moves nice and slowly on this curve, but then jumps on those straight parts because there aren't any points to actually move to. This is why it's important to make sure you're using uniform distribution of points in the intermediate points, keeping that uniform. So if I was to go into this bottom one now, and I think we might be okay with uniform actually, linear, set this to uniform. It's moving nicely again because it's referring to an internal uniform distribution of points along the spline, so it's going to work again. So that's why it's important. Make sure this is on uniform. That's the key takeaway there, which is how I've set this main spline. As you can see here, I've got this set to uniform. And if you need more definition, just increase this number here and make sure your rail is using the same. So that's the rail, or the railway track. The next one I'll be covering how to actually get the carriage to move along the track properly. So hopefully I'll see you in the next one.